You ever wonder what keeps a wild thing coming back? Night after night, rain or shine, especially when it clearly doesn't trust you. Before we begin, if stories like this touch your heart, please like the video, subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. It means a lot to us. It started in the bruised twilight of late October, that damp, clinging cold that seeps right into your bones. The kind of cold that makes the whole world feel smaller, quieter, like it's holding its breath. Leo was holding his breath too, metaphorically speaking. He sat in the worn armchair by the window of his tiny rented cottage, the one with the perpetually drafty door. Outside, maple leaves, once fiery, were now slick, dark commas plastered to the wet pavement. Streetlights cast long, watery reflections. The silence was thick, heavy. The kind that settled after the movers had left, after the last box was unpacked, after the echoing space of a life suddenly finally became just space. 6 months. That's how long it had been since the divorce papers were signed. 6 months since he'd traded the noisy, cluttered warmth of a shared city apartment for this quiet solitude in a sleepy coastal town. He told himself it was a fresh start. Needed healing. But mostly he just felt adrift, like a boat untethered in a foggy harbor. The cottage smelled faintly of mildew and old wood smoke, a scent that didn't quite feel like home yet. Or maybe ever. He'd stare at the blank walls, at the unfamiliar view of tangled, rain-slicked garden through the window, and feel a hollow ache, a profound loneliness that was less about missing her and more about missing belonging. Anywhere. That's when he first saw the shadow, or rather, felt it. Late one evening, as he was washing dishes at the small sink, a flicker of movement caught the corner of his eye. Just beyond the circle of light cast by the porch bulb. He froze, sponge dripping, peered out into the damp gloom. Nothing. He chalked it up to nerves. New place. Too much quiet. Too much thinking. But the next night, it was there again. And the night after that, a small, dark shape huddled low against the foundation, right beside his front step. Barely visible in the weak porch light. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just existed. A compact silhouette against the damp brick. Leo would turn off the kitchen light and watch from the darkened window. The shape would remain, motionless, guarded, a sentinel in the night. Curiosity eventually outweighed caution. One drizzly evening, heart thumping oddly against his ribs, Leo slowly cracked open the front door. Just an inch. Rain misted his face. The shape flinched. A low, almost inaudible hiss escaped it. Less threat, more pure, startled terror. That's when he saw it wasn't just a shadow. It was a cat. Thin, fur-matted and dark, like wet earth. One ear was ragged, torn almost clean through near the tip, a jagged, pale scar against the dark fur. But it was the eyes, huge, round discs reflecting the dim porch light, that held him. They weren't just scared. They were ancient, haunted, deep wells of wary exhaustion. He didn't move, didn't speak, just held the door open that tiny sliver, letting the warm, indoor light spill out onto the wet step beside the cat. The cat stared back, frozen, every muscle coiled tight. It looked impossibly fragile, and impossibly fierce. Leo slowly lowered a small saucer of milk onto the damp welcome mat, just inside the door's threshold. He didn't push it out. He just placed it, and then gently closed the door, leaving only darkness outside again. He waited, ear pressed to the cold wood. Minutes crawled by. Silence. Then the faintest sound. A delicate, almost hesitant lap. Lap, slap. Quick, efficient. Then, nothing. When he dared peek through the curtain an hour later, the saucer was empty, licked clean, and the small, dark shape was back in its spot against the foundation, huddled, watching the night. He named it Shadow, not out of affection, really. More accuracy. It was a creature of the periphery, a silent watcher. Leo started putting the saucer out every evening, just before dusk. Water. Sometimes a bit of leftover tuna. Always placed just inside the door as he closed it. Shadow never came while he was visible. Never acknowledged him beyond that initial flinch. It simply appeared, ate with frantic quietness, then retreated to its chosen spot beside the step. Rain lashed the windows. Shadow was there, a sodden lump pressed against the brick. Wind howled down the chimney. Shadow was there, fur ruffled, eyes narrowed against the gale. Frost painted delicate feathers on the grass. Shadow was there, a puff of breath visible in the frigid air, curled tightly into itself. Leo found himself waiting for it. That small ritual became a punctuation mark in his lonely evenings. The click of the latch, the soft scrape of the saucer, the tense silence, followed by those tiny, secretive lapping sounds. It was a connection, faint, fragile, one-sided, perhaps. But it was something, a presence outside his door, a small, wild heart beating in the cold dark, just a few feet from his own restless one. He'd lie in bed listening to the wind and wonder, why here? Why my step? Was it just the food? Or was there something else? Some invisible thread drawing this battered creature to his equally battered doorstep? One particularly raw night, rain hammering the roof like drumbeats, Leo stood at the window after placing the food. He didn't close the door immediately. He watched. Shadow emerged from the dripping rhododendrons, a phantom in the downpour. It paused, looking not at the food, but up, directly at the window, at Leo's silhouette behind the glass. For a long, suspended moment, those huge, reflective eyes held his through the rain-streaked pane. No fear this time, just a look, profoundly weary, deeply knowing. Then, with a flick of its ragged ear, it padded to the saucer, ignoring him completely. Leo closed the door slowly, leaned his forehead against the cool wood. That look, it hadn't been gratitude. It hadn't been affection. It was something else. Recognition, perhaps, of solitude, of simply enduring. He felt an unexpected lump form in his throat. This stray, this ghost of a cat sleeping outside his door every night, it wasn't just taking scraps. It was mirroring something back to him he hadn't wanted to see. His own isolation. His own quiet, nightly vigil against the world. He turned away from the door, the rain's rhythm filling the cottage. But the quiet inside felt different now. Less empty, charged with a fragile, unspoken understanding. Something small and impossibly significant had shifted in the damp, dark air. The faintest beginning of a story neither of them knew they were telling. Winter settled over the coastal town like a damp, gray blanket. The relentless drizzle of November hardened into the icy needles of December rain. Leo's cottage felt perpetually chilled, the old radiator groaning and clanking its uneven battle against the chill seeping through the thin walls. Yet, outside his door, a small, stubborn heartbeat persisted. Shut up. The ritual deepened, became the fragile spine of Leo's days. The saucer evolved. Milk was replaced by a small scoop of dry kibble Leo bought on a whim during a distracted grocery trip. Cat food. He'd stared at the bag in his cart, a flush creeping up his neck. Was he claiming the stray? The thought felt presumptuous, dangerous even. Shadow belonged to the wind, the rain, the shadowed corners. Not to him. Yet he bought it. That evening, the scrape of the ceramic saucer on the worn welcome mat sounded different. Louder, somehow. More deliberate. He closed the door quickly, heart thudding again, and pressed his ear to the wood. The silence stretched, longer than usual. Had he scared it off? Offered the wrong thing? Then the distinct, quiet crunching began. Delicate. Precise. Like tiny pebbles being broken. Relief washed over him, warm and surprising. He started talking. Not directly to Shadow, never while the cat was visible, but through the door. Soft murmurs as he placed the food down. Cold one tonight, pal. Or, hope the kibble's all right. Better than milk, I reckon. Or simply, hey. It felt foolish, talking to a closed door. But the silence inside the cottage had become a weight, and the simple act of forming words, however pointless, lightened it. Sometimes, after the crunching stopped, he'd hear it. The faintest sound. A soft thump against the base of the door. Not a scratch. Not a meow. Just a gentle press. Twice. Then silence again. Leo would hold his breath, a strange warmth blooming in his chest. Was it an accident? A nudge? Thank you? He never dared peek. He didn't want to shatter the delicate, wordless communication happening in the dark. He learned Shadow's rhythms. The cat arrived like clockwork just as the last gray light bled from the sky. It ate swiftly, efficiently, barely pausing. Then, it would retreat to its spot beside the step. But it didn't just sit anymore. It curled. Tightly. A compact, dark sphere of fur tucked against the foundation, sheltered as much as possible from the wind and rain. Leo began noticing details through the window pane, wiped clear of condensation. The way the fur on Shadow's flank was slightly lighter, a patchy gray-brown beneath the grime. The way its tail, when relaxed, curled neatly over its paws like a comma. The slow, rhythmic rise and fall of its breathing when it finally settled into sleep. Leo found himself watching that tiny movement, a metronome against the vast, indifferent night. One frigid afternoon, sleet stinging the windows, Leo sat bundled in his armchair, an old photo album open but unseeing on his lap. It was the anniversary, not of the divorce papers, but of the day they'd moved into their first apartment together. A lifetime ago. The memory hit him like a physical blow, the chaos of boxes, her laughter echoing off bare walls, the shared exhaustion and giddy hope. The hollow ache returned, sharper now, a cold stone in his gut. He closed the album, the worn leather suddenly repulsive. He needed air. Frostbitten air. He flung open the front door and froze. Shadow was there. Not curled in its usual spot, but pressed flat against the door itself, trying to leach any scrap of warmth escaping from the crack beneath. The sleet had plastered its fur into dark, icy spikes. It looked up at Leo, startled, eyes wide with a terror that quickly hardened into resignation. It didn't bolt. It just shivered. A full-body tremor that shook its small frame. Leo's breath caught. The raw vulnerability of it, the silent endurance, mirrored the cold stone inside him so perfectly it stole his voice. Jesus, he breathed, the word a puff of fog in the icy air. He acted on pure, desperate impulse. He stepped back, leaving the door wide open. Come on, he murmured, his voice rough. Just get out of the wet. Just for a minute. He gestured vaguely towards the worn rug just inside the threshold. He expected flight. Panic. Shadow stared at the open doorway. At the dim, warm light spilling onto the wet porch. At Leo, standing awkwardly back, hands held palms out, non-threatening. Its ragged ear twitched. Its gaze darted from Leo to the inviting dryness beyond the threshold, then back to the sleet-lashed garden. The internal battle was visible in every tense muscle. Trust or freeze? Finally, slowly, trembling violently, Shadow took one hesitant step. Then another. Its wet paws left dark, melting stars on the worn wooden floorboards just inside the door. It stopped dead, barely over the threshold, poised for flight. It didn't look at Leo. It stared fixedly at the rug, as if it were an alien landscape. Leo moved slowly, deliberately. He grabbed an old, threadbare towel from the bathroom, the kind too rough for human skin. He crouched down, keeping a vast distance, and gently slid the towel across the floor towards the shivering cat. "Here," he whispered. "Dry off. Just dry off." He retreated back to his armchair, turning slightly away, giving the illusion of privacy. He didn't look. He listened. The frantic hammering of his own heart. The relentless hiss of sleet outside. And then, the softest sound. A hesitant sniff at the towel. The pause. Then the delicate rasp of a rough tongue beginning to lick its sodden fur. Leo closed his eyes. The sound was profoundly intimate. A creature tending to itself, allowing that vulnerability inches from a human it barely tolerated. Shadow didn't stay long. 10 minutes, maybe. The licking stopped. Leo heard the soft pad of damp paws on wood, then the faintest thump as the cat jumped back down onto the porch. When Leo finally turned, the towel was rumpled, damp in patches, and Shadow was back in its spot outside, curled tightly once more. But something was different. The cat's gaze, when it briefly met Leo's through the glass, held less of the ancient wariness. Something else flickered there, a dazed kind of assessment? Curiosity? Leo slowly closed the door. The scent of wet fur and damp earth lingered in the small entryway. He picked up the towel. It held the faint, wild smell of the outdoors and the undeniable warmth where a small, cold body had briefly rested. Days turned into weeks. The open-door invitations became less terrifying, for both of them. Shadow would venture a little further inside each time a storm raged, always hovering near the door, always watchful. Leo learned to sit perfectly still, reading a book or pretending to, his peripheral vision cataloging every tiny movement. The way Shadow would cautiously sniff the leg of a chair. The way its ears swiveled like radar dishes at every distant sound. The slow, deliberate blinks it started giving Leo when their eyes accidentally met across the room. Cat kisses he'd read somewhere. A sign of trust. Each one felt like a tiny, hard-won victory. He started noticing things about himself too. The evenings felt less cavernous. The silence less oppressive. He found himself looking forward to the soft thump against the door after dinner. He bought a proper ceramic bowl, heavy enough not to tip. He placed it just inside the door, replacing the saucer. Shadow examined it suspiciously the first night, then ate with its usual focused intensity. Leo started leaving the door cracked open on milder nights, just an inch, while he sat nearby reading. He'd feel the cool night air brush his ankles, and sometimes the faintest vibration as Shadow settled on the welcome mat just outside the gap, a warm presence breathing in the darkness. One evening, deep in January, the air brittle with cold, Leo sat on the floor near the cracked door, his back against the wall, reading a worn paperback. Shadow was outside, a dark shape just beyond the threshold, occasionally shifting. The radiator clanked. The wind moaned softly around the eaves. Leo was lost in his book, the tension of the story pulling him in. He didn't notice the subtle shift at first. The soft padding sound was barely audible over the wind. Then the warmth. A distinct pressure against his thigh. He froze. Lowered the book infinitesimally slowly. Shadow was there. In sight. Not just over the threshold, but pressed against him. The cat's side was a solid line of warmth radiating through Leo's jeans. It wasn't curled. It was sitting upright, alert, gazing out into the dark garden through the cracked door, but its flank was firmly, deliberately leaning against Leo's leg. Its breathing was slow, steady. The contact was electric. Leo didn't dare move. Didn't dare breathe too deeply. He could feel the subtle vibration of the cat's body. The texture of its fur, still slightly rough but cleaner now. The solid weight of its small frame. He stared down at the top of Shadow's head, the ragged ear twitching slightly at a distant sound. This was beyond food. Beyond shelter from a storm. This was contact. Chosen. Offered. Leo so carefully, lifted his free hand. Not to pet, just to rest it lightly on the floor beside his own leg, palm up. An invitation. Or maybe just an acknowledgement. Shadow didn't look at it. Didn't flinch. It simply continued gazing out into the night, its body a warm, living anchor against Leo's leg. The radiator clanked again. The wind sighed. And in that quiet space, filled only by the shared rhythm of their breathing, Leo felt a crack open inside him. Not the jagged fracture of loss, but a softer, warmer fissure. Hope, perhaps. Or the simple, staggering recognition that he wasn't alone in the quiet dark anymore. A small, scarred creature had crossed a vast, invisible desert and chosen to lean against him. The weight of it, the trust of it, was a gift he hadn't known he needed, settling deep into the hollow spaces of his heart. He closed his eyes, not reading, just feeling the warmth, the solid presence. The silent pact sealed not with words, but with the quiet pressure of fur against denim. The world outside was cold, but right here, by the door, a tiny sun had ignited. Spring arrived on the coast not with a fanfare of blossoms, but a slow, reluctant thaw. The icy grip of winter loosened, replaced by a damp chill that clung stubbornly to the shade. Inside Leo's cottage, however, a fragile warmth had taken root. Shadow's presence, once confined to the doorstep in brief, storm-driven respites, had gently expanded. The cat now spent most evenings inside, often curled on the old towel Leo kept near the radiator, or sitting sentinel-like on the windowsill, watching the lengthening twilight. The deliberate lean against Leo's leg had become routine, a quiet claiming of space, a shared silence. Leo found himself talking to Shadow now, not just through the door. Simple observations. Looks like rain again. Or, that casserole was a disaster, huh? Shadow's responses were subtle. A slow blink, a flick of the ragged ear, a soft MRRT sound deep in its throat, barely audible, that seemed reserved solely for Leo. It felt domestic. Startlingly so. Leo started buying better cat food. Added a second, smaller water bowl near the radiator. Found himself browsing pet stores online, looking at scratching posts he had nowhere to put. He caught himself smiling more. The hollow ache, while not gone, felt cushioned, filled with the quiet purr of companionship he hadn't dared hope for. But then, the scratching started. It began subtly. Leo would be reading in his armchair, Shadow drowsing nearby. He'd hear it, a soft rhythmic scritch, 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 like claws carefully rasping against fabric. He'd glance over. Shadow would be kneading the old towel, eyes half closed, a picture of sleepy contentment. Normal cat behavior, he told himself. Comfort-seeking. A leftover instinct from kittenhood. He found it oddly endearing. Then, one rainy Tuesday evening, the sound changed. Louder. Sharper. More insistent. Not on the towel. Leo looked up from his book. Shadow was standing in the narrow hallway leading to the cottage's single, cramped bedroom. The cat was facing the wall, its body tense, tail held low. Not kneading. Scratching. Deliberately. Methodically. At the faded, floral-patterned wallpaper near the floorboards. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Scritch, scritch, scritch. "Hey," Leo said softly, setting his book down. "Whatcha doing, pal?" Shadow ignored him. Its focus was absolute. Its claws, usually sheathed during its quiet indoor moments, were fully extended, digging into the paper with a disturbing intensity. It wasn't playful. It wasn't comfortable. It looked driven, like it was trying to excavate something. Leo felt a prickle of unease slide down his spine. "Shadow!" He stood up slowly. The cat stopped instantly. It whipped its head around, eyes wide, pupils dilated. Not scared, exactly. Startled. Caught. For a long second, it just stared at Leo, its ragged ear twitching. Then, with a fluid motion, it turned and padded silently back to the living room, jumping onto the windowsill as if nothing had happened. Leo walked over to the spot. The wallpaper was shredded. Tiny flecks of paper littered the floorboards. He ran his fingers over the gouges. They felt deep, purposeful. Wire. The wall felt solid beneath the damaged paper. Nothing special. Just wall. He tried to dismiss it. A weird quirk. Maybe Shadow smelled a mouse in the wall? Old houses had those. But the unease lingered. It was the intensity. The focused, almost frantic energy Shadow had poured into that small patch of wall. It felt personal. Haunted. The scratching became a pattern. Always in the hallway. Always near the same spot, though sometimes it shifted a foot to the left or right. Always at dusk as the light began to fade. Shadow would seem restless beforehand, pacing the small living room, tail twitching. Then, drawn like a magnet, it would head to the hallway and begin. Leo tried distracting it with toys, a crumpled ball of foil, a feather on a string. Shadow would bat at them half-heartedly, then inevitably return to the wall. Leo tried blocking the spot with a small, heavy box. Shadow simply scratched around it, claws scraping against the wooden floorboards beneath the box's edge. One evening, after another session of futile scratching, Shadow didn't retreat to the windowsill. It sat down heavily in the hallway, right in front of the damaged wall. It didn't look at Leo. It stared fixedly at the gouged wallpaper. It did something new. It lifted its head slightly and yowled. Not a meow. Not a cry of pain. A low, mournful, guttural sound that seemed to rise from the very pit of its being. It echoed in the small hallway, raw and ancient and filled with a sorrow that stopped Leo's breath. The sound shattered the fragile domestic peace. It wasn't just strange behavior anymore. It was grief. Manifest. Palpable. Leo felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. What was buried in that wall? Or what memory was buried in Shadow that this spot triggered? He crouched down, a few feet away. "Shadow," he whispered, his own voice thick. "What is it? What's wrong?" The cat turned its head slowly. Its eyes, usually so guarded or gently observant, held a depth of anguish that rocked Leo. It looked lost. Desperately, inconsolably lost. It held his gaze for a long, heart-stopping moment. Then, it dropped its head, tucking it low against its chest, a small, defeated mound of fur in the dim hallway light. The incident changed the air in the cottage. Leo found himself avoiding the hallway, a sense of trespass clinging to it. Shadow became quieter, less inclined to lean against Leo in the evenings. It spent more time gazing out the window, its back to the room, its posture radiating a profound, silent melancholy. The scratching still happened, but less frequently, more hopelessly. As if Shadow knew its efforts were futile but couldn't stop the compulsion. Leo watched helpless. His own carefully constructed peace felt fragile, threatened by this unexplained sorrow emanating from the small creature he'd come to care for so deeply. He started noticing other things. How Shadow would sometimes freeze near the hallway entrance, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring, as if catching a scent Leo couldn't perceive. How it utterly refused to enter the bedroom, even when Leo left the door open. It would sit at the threshold, staring into the dark room, tail flicking nervously, before retreating. The bedroom held nothing remarkable, just Leo's unmade bed, a dresser, a small closet. But to Shadow, it seemed forbidden. The tension wasn't just external. It burrowed inside Leo. Shadow's silent grief mirrored his own buried pain back to him, amplified. He found himself staring at the gouged wallpaper, not just wondering about the cat's past, but prodding at his own locked rooms. The divorce wasn't just an ending. It was a landscape of failures and unspoken regrets he'd carefully walled off. Shadow's focused scratching felt like a metaphor. What was he relentlessly trying to dig up? Or bury deeper? The cat's anguish became a question he couldn't ignore, pointed directly at his own heart. One afternoon, while Shadow slept fitfully on the towel, Leo stood in the hallway, staring at the damaged wall. He'd lived here for months and barely glanced at it. Now, it felt like the focal point of the cottage. He noticed something he hadn't before. The wallpaper pattern wasn't uniform. Near the floorboards, partially obscured by the deepest scratches, the pattern changed slightly. It was older, faded differently, and just above it was a faint outline, almost invisible unless you knew to look. The outline of a small door. A cupboard? A cleaning access? It was painted over, seamlessly blending with the wall, the knob or handle long removed. Sealed shut. Forgotten. Leo's pulse quickened. Shadow hadn't been scratching randomly. It had been focused here, on this sealed, hidden compartment. What was inside? Dust? Pipes? Or something else? Something Shadow knew? Or remembered? He needed to know. Not just for Shadow's sake, but for his own. This silent, shared mystery had become a weight. The cat's sorrow was a hook in his own unresolved pain. He couldn't ignore the wall any more than Shadow could. He fetched a small utility knife from a kitchen drawer. The blade glinted dully in the hallway light. His hand trembled slightly. This felt like crossing a line, violating a boundary. But the image of Shadow's anguished yowl propelled him forward. He knelt before the sealed door outline. He glanced back towards the living room. Shadow was still asleep, a small, vulnerable rise and fall under its fur. Taking a deep breath, Leo pressed the tip of the knife into the seam where the old wallpaper met the newer layer covering the door's outline. He applied pressure. The paint cracked. A tiny sliver of the underlying wood was exposed. He began to carefully, slowly, score along the edge. The sound of the blade scraping against wood and paint was loud in the silent cottage. He He worked methodically, his focus absolute, the mystery of the wall and the echo of Shadow's grief narrowing his world to this single point. He didn't hear the soft pad of paws behind him, didn't sense the shift in the air. He only realized Shadow was there when a low growl vibrated through the hallway. Not loud, but primal, unmistakable. Leo froze, the knife poised. He turned his head slowly. Shadow stood a few feet away, back arched slightly, fur bristling along its spine. Its eyes weren't sorrowful now. They were blazing, fixed on the knife in Leo's hand, on the damaged wall. A look of pure, protective ferocity Leo had never seen before. It wasn't fear of Leo. It was fear for whatever lay behind that sealed door. A warning, clear and dangerous. Leo lowered the knife slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. The air crackled. Man and cat locked in a silent standoff over a hidden compartment in a wall, the unspoken grief of a stray cat suddenly colliding with the desperate need for answers. The simple warmth of companionship had fractured, replaced by a chilling question that hung between them, thick and heavy as the coastal fog rolling in outside. What was Shadow so desperate to reach, or so terrified to let him find? The mystery was no longer just Shadow's. It was theirs, and the fragile trust they'd built teetered on the edge of the blade still warm in Leo's hand. The scratching hadn't been the end of the strange behavior. It had only been the beginning of the unraveling. The wall held a secret, and Shadow, it seemed, was its fierce, grieving guardian. Leo slowly placed the knife on the floor, palms open, facing the cat. "Okay," he breathed, his voice barely audible. "Please, Shadow. I hear you." But the question remained, burning in the silence. What are you trying to show me? Or, what are you trying to protect? The cozy cottage sanctuary felt suddenly cold, filled with the ghosts of two broken pasts converging on a single, sealed point in the wall. The scratching had stopped. The real digging had just begun. The knife lay on the worn floorboards between them, a cold, metallic accusation. Leo's palms were open, facing Shadow, but the air felt thick enough to choke on. Shadow hadn't moved. Its back was still slightly arched, the ridge of fur along its spine standing stiffly. Those blazing eyes, fixed on Leo, held no trace of the weary companionship of the past weeks. Only a feral, protective intensity and a deep, wounded betrayal. It wasn't just guarding a wall. It was guarding a grave. Leo didn't dare breathe. One wrong move, he felt, would shatter everything. The trust painstakingly built over cold nights and shared silences gone. He slowly lowered his gaze from Shadow's fierce stare to the scored outline on the wall. The tiny sliver of exposed wood felt like an open wound. What lay behind it? What could evoke such raw, desperate guardianship from this scarred stray? "Shadow," Leo whispered, the name barely a breath. "I'm not hurting it. Whatever it is." His voice cracked. He sounded pathetic even to himself. How could he explain human curiosity to a creature ruled by instinct and grief? "I just need to understand. Like you understand the cold. Like you understood me." Shadow didn't blink. The low rumble started again, deeper this time, vibrating in the confined hallway. It took one deliberate step forward. Not towards Leo. Towards the wall. Towards the knife. Its intent was clear: stop. Or I make you stop. Leo felt a cold sweat prickle his neck. This was madness. Risking this fragile bond. For what? Dust? Old pipes? But then he remembered the yowl. That soul-rending sound of pure anguish. He remembered the hopeless scratching, night after night. The refusal to enter the bedroom. the profound sorrow that had dimmed Shadow's spirit. This wasn't just curiosity. It was bearing witness, sharing the burden. He couldn't walk away. Not now. Slowly, keeping his movements fluid and non-threatening, Leo shifted his weight. Not towards the knife. Away from it. He slid back, putting more distance between himself and the wall, until his shoulders bumped the opposite wall of the narrow hallway. He sat down heavily on the floor, drawing his knees up. He made himself small, non-confrontational. He kept his eyes lowered not on Shadow, but on the floor near his own feet. A gesture of submission, or respect. "I'm sorry," he murmured, the words thick. "I scared you. I didn't know." He took a slow, deliberate breath. "It's yours. Whatever's in there. I won't touch it. Not if you don't want me to." The words felt like ash in his mouth. The mystery would remain. The wall would stay sealed. Shadow's grief locked away. Just like his own. He waited. Seconds bled into minutes. The tension was a physical weight pressing down. He kept his gaze downcast, his posture open, defeated. He heard the soft pad of a paw. Another. Then the growl stopped. Abruptly, the silence that followed was even more profound. Leo dared to lift his eyes. Shadow was standing directly in front of the scored outline, its side towards Leo. It wasn't looking at him. It was staring fixedly at the damaged spot on the wall. The fierce arch had gone out of its back. Its fur lay flat again. But its entire body vibrated with a different kind of tension now. Not rage. Agony. It lifted a paw, hesitated, then gently, so gently, touched the exposed sliver of wood with its pad. Not scratching. Caressing. A tremor ran through the cat's small frame. It made a sound. Not a meow. Not a yowl. A soft, broken whimper. The sound of a heart breaking again. Leo felt the cold stone of his own grief shift, crack wide open. Tears, hot and sudden, blurred his vision. He didn't sob. He just sat there, tears tracing silent paths down his cheeks, watching this small, fierce creature touch the sealed tomb of its loss. Shadow's pain wasn't abstract anymore. It was a living, breathing thing in the hallway with them. It was the echo of every loss Leo had ever carefully boxed away. The failure of his marriage. The loneliness of this cottage. The fear of never belonging again. It all rushed in raw and suffocating. Shadow turned its head then. Slowly. Its eyes met Leo's. The blazing ferocity was gone. Extinguished. What remained was a depth of sorrow so profound, so utterly naked, it stole Leo's breath. It was the look he'd seen through the rain-streaked window on that first raw night, amplified 1,000 times. Recognition. Shared desolation. The cat took a hesitant step towards him. Then another. It stopped just beyond the knife still lying on the floor. Its gaze flickered from Leo's tear-streaked face to the scored wall and back again. A silent question hung in the air. "You see? You feel it too?" Leo nodded. A tiny, jerky movement. "Yeah," he choked out. "I see." He didn't move. Didn't reach out. He just held Shadow's gaze, letting the cat see his own unmasked pain. The shared vulnerability was terrifying and strangely liberating. Shadow looked back at the wall. A long, lingering look. Then, with a soft sigh that seemed to deflate its entire body, it stepped over the knife. Not around it. Over it. Deliberately. It walked the few steps to where Leo sat slumped against the wall. It didn't hesitate. It pressed its entire side against Leo's shin, leaning its weight into him. Not the tentative lean of before. A full, grounding press. Its head dropped, resting its chin on Leo's knee. Its eyes closed. A single, shuddering breath escaped it. Leo froze. Then, moving with infinite slowness, he lifted a trembling hand. He didn't reach for Shadow's head. He let his fingers hover, then gently rest on the cat's back, between its shoulder blades. The fur was warm, the body beneath solid and real. Shadow didn't flinch, didn't move away. It just pressed harder against his leg, a low, almost inaudible vibration starting deep in its chest. Not quite a purr, more like the hum of a weary engine finally finding a safe harbor. The dam broke. Leo's careful control shattered. A sob wrenched itself from his chest, harsh and ugly in the quiet hallway. Then another. He buried his face in his free hand, his shoulders shaking, the tears coming in hot, uncontrollable waves. The grief wasn't just Shadow's anymore. It was the accumulated weight of his own silent months. The loneliness, the failure, the terrifying uncertainty of starting over. He cried for the life he'd lost, for the pain Shadow carried, for the sheer, overwhelming relief of not being alone in the dark anymore. He cried until his throat was raw and his eyes burned. Through it all, Shadow remained, a warm, solid anchor against his leg. The faint vibration continued, a steady, grounding rhythm against the storm of Leo's tears. The cat didn't try to comfort him in any human way. It simply stayed, present, enduring, sharing the weight. When Leo's sobs finally subsided into shaky breaths, hiccups catching in his chest, he felt drained. Hollowed out, but lighter, cleansed. He lifted his head, wiping his face with a rough sleeve. Shadow opened its eyes, looking up at him. The ancient sorrow was still there, deep in those green-gold depths, but it was softer now. Understood. Leo looked past Shadow, to the scored outline on the wall. The mystery hadn't vanished. The pain hadn't dissolved. But the need to force it open had. Shadow had shown him what mattered wasn't what was hidden behind the wall, but the grief it represented. And by sharing that grief, by letting Leo see it, truly see it, the cat had offered a different kind of opening. Leo gently stroked the fur between Shadow's shoulder blades. "Okay," he whispered, his voice raspy but clear. "Okay." He didn't say what was okay. He didn't need to. Shadow blinked slowly. A cat kiss. Acceptance. Forgiveness, perhaps. Leo shifted slightly, wincing at the stiffness in his limbs. He nudged the knife with his foot, sliding it further down the hallway, away from the wall, away from them. A symbolic gesture. The threat was gone. Shadow watched the knife move, then looked back at Leo. Its gaze was calm now. Exhausted but calm. The fierce guardian had stood down. The grieving creature had been seen. Leo pushed himself up slowly, his legs trembling. Shadow stood too, stretching languidly, its tail curling upwards. It looked at the wall one last time, then deliberately turned its back on it. It padded towards the living room, pausing at the doorway to look back at Leo. An invitation. Leo followed. He didn't look back at the scored outline. The compartment could stay sealed. Its secret, whatever it was, belonged to Shadow. The real revelation had already happened. Not in the wall, but in the shattered open space between a broken man and a grieving cat, where tears had washed away the barriers, and simple, steadfast presence had become the most profound gift. He sank into his armchair. Shadow jumped up onto the adjacent windowsill, curling into its usual spot. But this time, it didn't turn its back. It watched Leo. The purr, tentative at first, grew louder, a soft, rumbling counterpoint to the returning sound of the wind outside. The storm within had passed. leaving behind a landscape forever changed by the raw, healing power of shared sorrow, witnessed and held in the quiet dimness of a forgotten hallway. The wall hadn't been breached, but two hearts finally had been. The silence after the storm wasn't empty. It was full, filled with the steady rumble emanating from the windowsill, a sound that seemed to vibrate in Leo's bones, settling the last tremors of his own emotional earthquake. He sat in his armchair, not reading, not thinking with the frantic energy of before. Just breathing, feeling the residual ache in his throat from crying, the strange lightness in his chest, and the profound warmth radiating from the small creature purring beside him. Shadow hadn't moved. Curled on the sill, eyes half closed, watching the raindrops trace paths down the glass. But the watchfulness was different. Not the tense alertness of the wild thing, nor the heavy sorrow of the grieving guardian. It was peaceful. The kind of stillness that comes not from exhaustion, but from surrender. To safety. To being seen. Leo watched the slow rise and fall of Shadow's flank. The ragged ear relaxed against its head. The fierce, grieving creature was still there, beneath the fur. But it was resting. Finally, life in the cottage didn't magically transform overnight. The gray coastal light still filtered through the windows. The radiator still clanked its uneven song. The hollow ache of Leo's past didn't vanish, but it shifted. It no longer felt like a cold stone lodged in his gut. It felt more like weather. Something that passed through him, sometimes heavy and gray, sometimes just a distant chill he could acknowledge without being consumed. He realized he'd been holding his breath for months, bracing. Now that he could exhale, the hallway wall remained. The scored outline, the damaged wallpaper, a visible scar. Leo didn't cover it up. He didn't try to fix it. It became part of the cottage's landscape, like the drafty door or the uneven floorboard near the kitchen. He'd walk past it, sometimes pausing, not with the desperate need to pry it open, but with a quiet nod of acknowledgement. It's there. It matters. We don't need to disturb it. Shadow's relationship with it changed too. The frantic scratching ceased entirely. Leo would sometimes find the cat sitting quietly in the hallway, not facing the wall, but sitting beside it, just keeping it company. A silent vigil for whatever memory lay sealed within. No more yowls. Just a soft sigh, a slow blink, then a pat of paws back to the living room, often seeking Leo's proximity. The bedroom remained off-limits for Shadow. Leo would leave the door open on sunny afternoons, hoping the light might entice it. Shadow would approach the threshold, sniff the air, stare into the room with that same old wariness, then turn away. Leo didn't push. He understood boundaries now in a way he hadn't before. Some doors stayed closed. Some griefs preferred their own space. He respected it. Their routines deepened, infused with a new, quiet intimacy. The evening food ritual became less about sustenance, more about connection. Leo would fill the ceramic bowl, the clink of kibble a familiar, comforting sound. He'd place it near the door, but now, instead of closing it immediately, he'd often leave it open a crack, sitting nearby on the floor. Shadow would enter, not with the frantic hunger of the early days, but with a calm purpose. It would eat, then often pad over to Leo, bumping its head against his knee before settling beside him, leaning its warm weight against his leg. The contact wasn't tentative anymore. It was claimed, reciprocal. Leo found himself automatically resting a hand on Shadow's back as he read, feeling the vibration of the purr resonate up his arm. It was a simple touch, grounding and profound. Mornings held a new rhythm. Leo would wake to find Shadow not on the windowsill, but curled on the old towel near the radiator, or sometimes on the rug beside his bed, still respecting the bedroom threshold, but close. The first sight of that compact, sleeping form, the soft rhythm of its breath, became a quiet anchor for Leo's day. He'd make coffee, the rich aroma mingling with the faint, clean scent of the cat, no longer wild and earthy, but a comfortable, domestic smell. He'd talk to Shadow as it stretched, its yawns revealing tiny, needle-sharp teeth. Simple things. "Morning, pal." Rain stopped. Or, "Think I'll tackle that overgrown bit in the garden today." Shadow would blink slowly, stretch again, and follow him to the kitchen, a silent, attentive Shadow once more, but one that radiated warmth, not distance. Leo started noticing the world outside the cottage again. The stubborn green shoots pushing through the damp earth in the neglected garden. The way the morning light caught the dew on spiderwebs. The briny tang of the sea air carried on the breeze. He bought seeds. Took the rusty spade from the shed. He didn't have a grand plan, just a need to tend to something, to nurture. He'd work in the small garden patch, turning the cold soil, Shadow often sitting nearby on the low stone wall, watching him with calm, unblinking eyes. Planting something new in the damp earth. Mirroring the fragile, growing thing taking root inside the cottage walls. He also started noticing Shadow differently. Not just the scars and the wary eyes, but the small, unique details. The way one white whisker curled slightly at the tip. The patch of softer, lighter fur behind its good ear. The precise way it cleaned its paws, fastidious and thorough. And one rainy afternoon, as Shadow stretched luxuriously on the rug, Leo saw it. A thin, faded strip of blue material, almost the color of worn denim, nearly buried in the thick fur around its neck. A collar, or what remained of one. Snapped, frayed at the edges, clearly having been worn for a very long time before breaking. Leo's heart clenched. Proof. Tangible proof Shadow hadn't always been wild. Someone, somewhere, had once fastened that collar. Had once claimed this small, fierce heart. The sight didn't bring back Shadow's sorrow. The cat merely blinked at him, purring. But for Leo, it added another layer of understanding to the depth of loss sealed behind that wall. It wasn't just a loss. It was the loss. The defining one. He didn't mention the collar fragment. He didn't try to remove it. It was part of Shadow's story, woven into its fur, a silent testament to a life before the cold steps and the shared grief. Leo understood the sanctity of relics. He had his own, the photo album now tucked away on a high shelf, not forgotten, but no longer a raw wound. He respected Shadow's. The blue thread became just another detail in the tapestry of their shared existence. Weeks melted into a gentle, rain-washed spring. The tension, the desperate mystery of the hallway, had dissolved into a quiet peace. There was still sorrow. Leo felt it like a familiar tune sometimes humming beneath the surface of his thoughts, and he saw it in the way Shadow still sometimes sat beside the wall. But it wasn't sharp anymore. It wasn't consuming. It was integrated. A thread in the fabric, not the whole cloth. Leo found himself smiling more easily. Not the forced smile of someone pretending to be okay, but the genuine, quiet upturn of lips at Shadow's ridiculous concentration while watching a fly buzz against the window, or the simple pleasure of a warm cup of tea on a cool morning. The cottage began to smell less of mildew and loneliness, and more of coffee, earth from the garden, and the faint, comforting scent of cat. One evening, as Leo sat on the floor near the still cracked door, Shadow leaning solidly against him, he looked around the small living room. The worn armchair, the books piled haphazardly, the ceramic cat bowl near the threshold, the faint outline of a sealed compartment visible down the hall. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the life he'd planned. Messy, full of quiet moments and hard-won peace. He looked down at Shadow, who chose that moment to lift its head and give him a slow, deliberate blink. A cat kiss. Leo smiled, a real one, reaching down to gently scratch behind the cat's ragged ear. Shadow leaned into the touch, its purr kicking up a notch. "Thanks, pal," Leo murmured, his voice thick with an emotion that wasn't sadness, but a deep, resonant gratitude. For the company, for the trust, for the shared storm and the quiet harbor they'd found on the other side. He'd come here seeking a fresh start, expecting emptiness. Instead, he'd found a story written in purrs and shared silence, in grief acknowledged and peace nurtured, one small, scarred heartbeat at a time. The cottage wasn't just a place anymore. It was a home. Not because the walls changed, but because the heart within them finally had someone to hold on to. The stray sleeping outside his door hadn't just sought shelter. It had offered him a reflection, a shared journey through the dark, and finally, a quiet place to land. Together. The question of why his step had faded into insignificance. The only answer that mattered was curled warm against his leg, purring contentedly into the soft, rain-washed night. The story wasn't about the mystery behind the wall anymore. It was about the fragile, resilient bridge built across the silence in front of it. The piece they'd forged felt solid, woven into the fabric of their days like the salt in the coastal air. Leo woke not to an alarm, but to the soft, gray light filtering through the curtains and the familiar weight of expectation, the quiet presence waiting beyond the bedroom door. He stretched, the sheets cool, the cottage holding its morning breath. Silence. Not the heavy silence of before, but a comfortable, companionable quiet. He listened. No padding footsteps. No soft MRRT from the hallway. Unusual. Shadow was a creature of habit, usually waiting near the kitchen by now, anticipating the kibble scoops rattle. A flicker of unease, quickly dismissed. Probably basking in a patch of sun on the windowsill. Leo swung his legs out of bed, the floorboards cool under his feet. He padded to the bedroom door, opening it slowly. The living room was bathed in the soft, pearly light of early morning. Empty. The towel by the radiator lay smooth. The windowsill was vacant. Leo's gaze swept the room, landing finally on the front door. It was closed, but a thin sliver of golden light spilled beneath it from the rising sun outside. And there, just inside the threshold, lay Shadow. The cat wasn't sleeping. It was sitting upright, utterly still, its gaze fixed intently on something on the worn welcome mat directly in front of it. Its tail was curled neatly around its paws, but its posture radiated a focused stillness Leo hadn't seen since the hallway wall. Not grief, not tension, something else. Anticipation? Offering? "Hey, pal," Leo murmured, his voice husky with sleep. "What ya got there?" Leo moved closer, his bare feet silent on the cool floorboards. As he neared, Shadow finally lifted its head. Its eyes met Leo's, clear, calm, holding a depth of quiet knowing that made Leo's breath catch. Then, deliberately, the cat lowered its gaze back to the mat. Leo followed its look. There, on the faded coir weave, lay a small, perfect sparrow. Its feathers were a soft, intricate tapestry of browns and grays, utterly still. Unharmed. Not mangled. Not played with. Simply placed. As if arranged with infinite care. Its tiny beak was closed, its eyes shut. It looked peaceful. rested. A small, feathered offering laid precisely in the rectangle of morning sunlight streaming under the door. Leo froze. Not in disgust, but in awe. The gesture was so pure, so utterly cat, yet imbued with a significance that transcended instinct. This wasn't a trophy. This wasn't play. This was a gift. The first gift Shadow had ever brought him. And it was dead, presented with a solemnity that felt sacred. Memories flooded him. The frantic sparrow he'd rescued years ago from his city apartment balcony, nursing it in a shoebox lined with soft cloths until it could fly free. The way he'd always paused to watch birds in the garden here, their quick, darting lives a counterpoint to his own stillness. Shadow had watched him watch them, had seen his quiet fascination, his gentle respect for their fragile existence. Had this tiny life been caught in the dawn hunt? Or found already still? Leo didn't know. The how didn't matter. The why resonated through him like a struck bell. This was Shadow's language. The only language it had beyond purrs and blinks and shared silences. It couldn't bring flowers. It couldn't write a note. It brought what it understood as precious, valuable, worthy of offering. Life, captured and stilled. A token of its world. A symbol of its hunting prowess, yes, but also a symbol of trust. This is what I value. This is what I can do. I give it to you. He knelt on the floor, keeping a respectful distance from the small offering and the cat who had presented it. Shadow watched him, its green-gold eyes unblinking. Leo looked from the perfect, still bird to Shadow's calm, expectant face. He saw the faint blue thread of the old collar still nestled in the fur at its neck. He saw the ragged ear. He saw the creature who had survived loss and cold and mistrust, who had slowly, painfully learned to lean against him. Enough of this. Shadow, Leo whispered, his voice thick. It's beautiful. He didn't touch the bird. He didn't recoil. He simply met Shadow's gaze and let the cat see the awe, the gratitude, the profound understanding washing over him. This wasn't just a dead bird. It was a key. It unlocked the final chamber of the mystery Shadow carried, the one not behind the wall, but within its own wild, loyal heart. The gift wasn't the sparrow. The gift was the offering itself. The vulnerability of it. The declaration, "You are worthy of my hunt. You are worthy of what I hold precious." Shadow regarded his open palm. It didn't move towards it. Instead, it stretched its neck forward slowly, deliberately, and gently, ever so gently, butted its forehead against Leo's knuckles. A firm, affectionate nudge. A benediction. You understand. Leo's eyes stung, but not with the old, familiar grief. This was different. A welling up of pure, unadulterated love and respect for this small, fierce, complex creature who had chosen him, who had shared its sorrow, its guarded trust, and now, its deepest, wildest offering. He gently curled his fingers, scratching lightly behind Shadow's good ear. The cat leaned into the touch, a low, rumbling purr starting deep in its chest, vibrating against Leo's hand. The sound filled the quiet room, mingling with the birdsong outside, life and death, wildness and domesticity, held in a fragile, perfect balance. Leo knew what he had to do. The gift demanded respect. He fetched a small, clean trowel from the garden shed. Shadow followed him outside, a silent observer, as Leo walked to the far corner of the small garden, near the stone wall where the cat often sat watching him work. The earth was soft from recent rain. He dug a small, neat hole. Deep enough. He lined it with a handful of soft, green moss. Then, with infinite care, he lifted the small, perfect sparrow from the welcome mat. It felt impossibly light, fragile, precious. He carried it outside, Shadow padding silently beside him. He placed the bird gently in the moss-lined hollow, covered it with the dark, rich soil. Patting it smooth, he found a smooth, gray stone from the beach nearby and placed it as a marker. Simple, unadorned, a tiny grave for a tiny life, offered as a token of something vast and wild and deeply loving. He stood up. Shadow sat beside the freshly turned earth, its gaze fixed on the small stone. Not with sorrow, Leo realized, but with a quiet satisfaction. A job completed, an offering accepted and honored. The cat looked up at Leo, blinked slowly, then turned and padded back towards the cottage door, tail held high. Leo followed. Inside, the morning light felt warmer, fuller. Leo filled Shadow's ceramic bowl. The cat ate with its usual focused calm. But when it finished, it didn't retreat to the windowsill. It walked directly to Leo, who stood leaning against the kitchen counter, sipping his coffee. Shadow rubbed its entire body along his bare calf, a long, sinuous movement of pure affection. Then it sat at his feet, looking up, its purr a steady, contented rumble. The offering had been made. The circle was complete. Leo looked down at the cat, then his gaze drifted, almost of its own accord, down the hallway. To the scarred wall. To the sealed compartment. He understood now. Shadow's gift wasn't just about the sparrow. It was about the blue thread of the collar. It was about the grief sealed behind the wall. It was about Leo's own past, carefully packed away. Shadow hadn't brought him a dead bird. It had brought him a symbol of release. A tiny, feathered metaphor saying, "We carry our pasts. We honor what was lost. But we also offer what we have now. We bury the old tokens with respect. And we keep living. We keep hunting. We keep offering." Leo set his cup down. He crouched, not to offer a hand this time, but to wrap his arms gently around Shadow's sturdy body, burying his face for a moment in the thick, warm fur at the cat's neck. He felt the purr vibrate against his cheekbone, a primal rhythm of contentment. He smelled the clean scent of the cat, the faint, wild tang of the outdoors still clinging to it, and the undeniable scent of home. "Thank you," he whispered into the fur, the words muffled but fervent. "Thank you for the gift." Shadow didn't squirm. It pressed its weight back into him, accepting the embrace, its purr deepening into a resonant thrum that seemed to say everything words never could. The stray sleeping outside his door had brought him many things: companionship, a mirror to his grief, a shared path through the dark. But this small, feathered offering laid in the dawn light, this was the final, unexpected gift. Not of possession, but of understanding. Not of life captured, but of love offered in the only language Shadow knew. And Leo understood it perfectly. The mystery of the wall was no longer a burden. The fragment of collar was no longer just a relic. They were simply part of the story. A story that continued now, bathed in the quiet, golden light of a new morning, with a small, fierce heart purring solidly against his own. The gift wasn't the sparrow. The gift was the wild, enduring, utterly trustworthy love of a creature who had chosen to share its world with him, feathers, fur, grief, and all. And in that moment, Leo knew he had finally learned how to receive it. The sparrow's tiny grave, marked by the smooth gray stone, became part of the garden's quiet tapestry. Leo didn't tend it obsessively. He simply knew it was there. A small, sacred patch of earth where wildness and tenderness had met. Like the scarred wall inside, it wasn't something to fix or hide. It was a landmark. A testament. Life flowed around these landmarks, softer, richer. The frantic edge of Leo's loneliness had truly smoothed. He wasn't just coping anymore. He was living, fully. Awake to the salt sting on the wind, the damp richness of the garden soil under his nails, the intricate pattern of frost on the windowpane on a cold morning. He noticed the way Mrs. Henderson down the lane always wore a bright yellow raincoat, like a splash of sun against the gray. He started returning the hesitant nods of Mr. Davies, who walked his ancient terrier at dawn. The town wasn't just a backdrop anymore. It was becoming community. Thread by fragile thread. Shadow was the quiet conductor of this new rhythm. The cat's presence was a grounding force. Leo found himself structuring his days less around avoidance, more around shared moments. The morning coffee ritual, Shadow weaving figure eights around his ankles. The quiet reading hour in the evening, the cat a warm, purring weight against his thigh, radiating a contentment that seeped into Leo's own bones. The deliberate walk to the garden, Shadow trotting ahead or pausing to inspect a beetle, tail held high like a furry question mark. Simple acts. Profound anchors. The cat's personality unfurled like a fern in spring. Playfulness emerged, a sudden, hilarious sideways hop at a falling leaf, a focused, intense stare followed by a lightning-fast paw-swat at a dust mote dancing in a sunbeam. Leo laughed, a real, unfettered sound that sometimes startled even him. He bought a simple feather wand. Shadow's transformation was instantaneous, hunter incarnate, eyes blazing, leaps defying gravity, a whirlwind of focused joy that left them both breathless and grinning. It was a side Leo had never glimpsed during the long, weary nights on the step or the heavy sorrow by the wall. It was pure, unadulterated life, reclaimed. He saw the blue thread of the collar more often now. Shadow seemed less inclined to keep it buried. It would catch the light as the cat stretched, or when Leo scratched under its chin. Leo never touched it, never mentioned it. It was simply part of Shadow. A whisper from a past life, a chapter that had shaped the creature who now chose to share his present. He understood the sanctity of such relics. He thought of his own past, the photo album no longer gathering dust on a high shelf, but tucked away in a drawer. He could look at it now, sometimes, not with the sharp pang of failure, but with a quieter, more complex ache recognition of love that was, and loss that shaped who he became. He didn't need to burn the album. He didn't need to worship it. He could simply acknowledge it, like the wall, like the grave. One crisp autumn afternoon, Leo sat on the low stone wall at the garden's edge, a mug of tea warming his hands. The sea was a vast, shimmering expanse of blue-gray, capped with white. Shadow sat beside him, not on the wall, but on the sun-warmed grass, meticulously cleaning one white-tipped paw. The air held the tang of salt and decaying leaves, a bittersweet perfume. Leo watched the cat, the familiar outline against the rolling hills beyond. The ragged ear, the sturdy body, the quiet dignity. He thought about the question that had haunted him that first damp October night. Why here? Why my step? The answer, he realized, wasn't found in logic or fate. It wasn't about the food or the shelter, or even Leo himself, specifically. It was about resonance. Two fractured melodies, wandering in the gray, finding an unexpected harmony. Shadow, carrying its sealed grief and the ghost of a blue collar. Leo, carrying his divorce papers and the echo of a life dismantled. They hadn't healed each other's wounds. Not really. Wounds like that, they scar. They change you. But they had offered each other something far more essential: presence. Witness. a safe harbor in which to be broken, to grieve without judgment, to simply exist together in the quiet aftermath. Shadow finished its paw, gave a full body stretch that ended in a delicate yawn, then hopped up onto the wall. Not beside Leo, but directly onto his lap. It circled once, twice, kneading his thigh gently through his jeans with blunt claws, then settled, a warm, purring puddle of fur. Leo rested his hand lightly on the cat's back, feeling the familiar vibration thrum against his palm. He looked out at the sea, the vastness no longer intimidating but beautiful. A reflection of the depth of feeling this small creature had unlocked within him. Love, he understood now, gazing down at the top of Shadow's head, wasn't about fixing. It wasn't about erasing the past or demanding wholeness. It was about showing up, night after night, rain or shine, with a saucer of milk, with an open door during a storm, with silent companionship by a scarred wall, with a gentle touch after tears, with the profound, wordless offering of a perfectly still sparrow laid in the dawn light. It was about choosing again and again to lean against the warmth of another beating heart, even when your own felt fragile. It was about building a bridge across the silence, one shared breath, one slow blink, one small, trusting gesture at a time. Shadow had taught him that belonging wasn't about fitting perfectly into a pre-existing space. It was about creating a space, together, where imperfection was not just allowed, but cherished. Where the ragged edges and the sealed compartments and the tiny graves were simply part of the landscape. Where trust wasn't demanded, but earned, grain by grain, in the quiet patience of shared days. The stray sleeping outside his door hadn't just sought shelter. It had offered him a language older than words. A language of purrs and presence, of gifts given in feathers and trust earned in silence. It had taught him how to receive love, not as a prize, but as a wild, precious, fiercely offered gift. The cottage behind them wasn't grand. The garden was still small, fighting the coastal wind. The radiator still clanked. But it was home. Not because it was perfect, but because within its walls, two lost creatures had found an unexpected, perfectly imperfect way to belong. To each other. Leo stroked the fur behind Shadow's good ear, feeling the rumble intensify. He looked out at the horizon, where the sea met the sky in a seamless line, and felt a profound peace settle over him, as deep and enduring as the ocean's rhythm. It wasn't the absence of sorrow. It was the presence of something stronger, woven through the scars and the silence. A quiet, resilient joy. The story of the wall, the collar, the sparrow, they weren't endings. They were simply the notes that made their shared song unique. A song that continued now, purring softly against his chest, warm and alive and utterly, profoundly home. This story of a stray who chose a lonely step, a sealed grief, and a gift offered in feathers, it found its way to you. And if it resonated, if it touched that quiet place where we keep our own stories of loss, hope, and unexpected connection, then you understand why stories like this matter. Before you go, if Leo and Shadow's journey moved you, do us a huge favor. Smash that like button. It tells us these stories matter. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. We share new, heart-touching tales just like this every single week. Don't miss the next one. Comment below. Tell us where in the world you're listening from, or share a story of an animal who changed your life. Your words fuel our next stories. Share this video. Someone else might need this moment of warmth today. Thank you for listening, for sharing this space, and for believing in the quiet magic of a second chance offered on a cold doorstep. Until the next story, Take care of your heart. And remember, sometimes the most profound gifts come on silent paws, wrapped in the quiet language of trust.